guys, Neona here, and I am so excited for today's stream. We're gonna wait a little bit though for the rest of the people, if any more people to come in. So we'll wait like 5 minutes. Um, yeah. Hello Jane for being the first person here, and the only person here. I'm just gonna say hello. um, if you don't know what's going on today, is horror story stream. It's a nice, spoopy horror story stream where I read creepypastas, maybe popular, maybe not that popular, off of the internet. And this will also be my first reaction to them. I have not pre-read them. If there's anything sketchy in them, may I per se, that could get me canceled, then move on to the next one if I find something like that. But yeah. Feel free to chat in the chat, like always. And yeah. Love this music. Alright, we got like 45 seconds before I'm starting the creepypastas. Um, I am very excited. This is probably not going to be my longest stream, but going to be my longest stream while I am awake and conscious. um, yeah. So. Alright, let's get started. I paused the music for reasons. Alright, here we go. So, first creepypasta we're reading. If I could get past all those advertisements everywhere. Hold on a sec. Is a very common one, and it's called Slender Man. It's a very popular one. Very popular. I'm pretty sure everyone in this thing has heard of Slender Man. Alright. Here we go. Let me fix my monitor real quick. There we go. Alright. If only you hadn't looked back. It was the autumn. Let me try again. If only you hadn't looked back. Though it was autumn, the day had seemed long and the brief walk towards home short. As the sunlight began to fade, you and your two friends left the playground behind and trudged reluctantly home, knowing that you would be forced to pick up the games and conversations the next day. The next day, that never came. If only you hadn't looked back, but you had. Turning just for a moment, you glanced back towards the tree line, seeing the figures of their branches clawing up towards the sky. Beside them, the figure. At first you thought you must be mistaken, but your eyes in the hazy blur of twilight were playing tricks on you. But no. When you looked again, he was still there, taller than any man could be, thinner than even the willowy branches that extended ever upward from the trees. He loomed. Hold on a sec. I'm adjusting because my scroller wheel won't work. He loomed in the distance, like a shadow of some horrible, dark truth. You knew instantly that you had to look away, that if you didn't tear your eyes from the blank, featureless face, then soon the blank would wash over you, become you, and you would walk slowly but surely, as if pulled by some magnetic force toward him, though you feared him, though you weren't scared of his unnatural height, the aching blank whiteness of his face, the arms that seemed to stretch toward you and slithering tentacles behind. You turned, screwing up your eyes, willing yourself not to look back, not to see, not to give in and go to him. You scream, and to the others, telling them the same, telling them not to look, but as you open your eyes, you realize they had already looked. They were gone. Possibly the most famous creepypasta character of all time, and certainly one of those that has crossed most frequently into the mainstream media, the Slender Man, also known as Slenderman, is a character born of a variety of early influences, but which itself represents an evolution and uses... Forget this. This isn't even a creepypasta. This is a wiki page. The first two paragraphs seem promising, and this is why you shouldn't trust paragraphs. Anyways, it's creepypasta, because I don't think anyone wants to read the wiki page of Slenderman. This creepypasta is called Nighty Night. It is by Tim Sprague. For the past 5 years, it's just been Ian and me. My wife's pregnancy with him wasn't easy. There were a number of scare and close calls due to the health issues that she experienced all her life. Every doctor she had ever been to had told her that she would never be able to get pregnant in the first place. She put a brave face and joked that she would just get an entire litter of puppies instead, but when she was thinking about it and didn't know I was watching her, real feelings were etched all over her face. She loved kids, and though of not being able to have one herself was heartbreaking for her, and the thought of not being able to. We discussed other options, of course, adoption, fostering, you name it, and we looked into it. We had a meeting scheduled with an adoption agency when a miracle happened. That miracle was Ian. Against all the odds, Ellen became pregnant. Her doctors were at complete loss. It should have been impossible. Suddenly there we were, talking about converting our second bedroom into a nursery and planning out how to shuffle around our work schedules to make sure that one of us would always be home with the baby. The complications began about 4 months into pregnancy. It seemed like every few weeks we were at the hospital while the staff ran tests or performed procedures. Ellen was amazing during all of it. I was acting like a complete lunatic, worried out of my mind about every little thing. But she would just lay there in the uncomfortable hospital bed, stroking her increasingly large belly and smiling to herself. She would tell me that knew that everything would work out in the end, and that all of the issues were just bumps in the road. When she went into early labor, just a few days before the 31-week mark, she waddled into the kitchen and told me in a very calm, matter-of-fact tone that the baby was coming. I had been getting ready for bed, so in the same collected manner that she retrieved the bag and we packed weeks earlier and that we had packed the bag we had packed weeks earlier in the car, keys, while I frantically got dressed and grabbed the few necessary items that hadn't gone into the bag yet. 6 hours later, Ian was born. He was so small, and I could feel my heart sink as he emerged. The doctor immediately took him over to a radiant warmer table where he and the nurse began working with him. A second nurse kept me from getting too close to ensure that I didn't get in the way. The activity suddenly stopped, and the most wonderful sound filled our room. Our son started to cry. The doctor informed me that due to Ian's size, he would need to spend a couple of weeks in the newborn intensive care units. But from what he could see, the child would be fine. I remember feeling so relieved that I had put a hand on the bed's footboard to steady myself. My fingers had just touched the plastic when the alarm on Ellen's monitor went off. Ian and I lost her in less than an hour. It wasn't anything that the hospital staff did wrong. It wasn't anything that could have been prevented. The stress of the labor and birth had been too much for her, and she suffered massive hemorrhaging. The staff did their absolute best to save her. It wasn't possible. She never even got to hold Ian before she was gone. I never got a chance to mourn her. I was now a single parent, and all that mattered was a tiny little baby in the NICU. The next few weeks were spent going to work, getting through my shift, and immediately returning to the hospital to sit with Ian all night before doing it all over again. Shortly before he was released, I secured a position with a new company. It paid less but allowed me to work from home. Without much of a family support system, I needed to be there for him at all times. After all, it was just me and him now. I wish so much that Ellen could see the incredible child that we made together. He's loving, energetic, frustrating, confounding, and so much more. He's everything we could have hoped for and much more. He's also a very vivid imagination for his age, which is partly why I didn't believe him when he first told me that he was being visited by something during the night. It took a while to get to this point, but we've settled into a routine each evening. We have dinner together, spend an hour running around outside if the weather's nice or playing inside if it isn't. Ian gets his bath and then he lays down to sleep for the night. The routine is supposed to finish around 8 o'clock each night, but if you have kids, you know no routine is foolproof. On the first night that he was visited, I didn't manage to get him wrangled into bed until almost 9. I was catching up on my work at my desk when I heard Ian yell for me. I'm ashamed to admit that it was my first reaction to feel irritated. Normally when he called out like that, it was to try to get one last drink of water or tell me that he isn't tired and can't go to sleep. That would happen at least twice a week. I said I have an incredible child, not one who wasn't prone to the usual 4-year-old tendencies. When the immediate When he immediately cried out a second time, though, I stood up and pushed my chair back so hard it tipped over. There was a panic in his voice. I hurried up the short flight of stairs to the second floor and flung open his door, my hand immediately going to the light switch. Ian was sitting in his bed with tears streaming down his face. The left leg of his pajamas were pulled up and his hands pressed down on the skin. The sheets and comforters of his bed were laying on the floor. His pillow was hanging halfway off the mattress. I hurried over to him and knelt down next to this bed, putting down the safety rail as I did so. He immediately flung his arms around my neck and started crying harder. The sobbing was so intense that he started to cough uncontrollably. I pried him off of me and held him in my lap to allow him to catch his breath. We sat there for a long time, him crying and sniffing loudly with me gently stroking his hair and telling him that everything was all right. When he had finally calmed down, I sat him on the edge of his bed and took his hands away from the legs. There were 3 long scratches running down it. They weren't deep, but there were a few tiny beads of blood. I gently asked him what was happening. He remained silent. I asked him again, and this time he lifted his head and looked at me in the eyes. Nighty-night hurt me, he told me in a tiny voice. I looked back at him in confusion. I didn't know what I had expected him to say, but it certainly hadn't been that. Nighty-night, he asked softly, like what I tell you at night before you go to sleep. Nighty-night, I repeated more forcefully this time. He scratched me like the bad cat did. After his 3rd birthday, he had been scratched by the neighbor's kitten while trying to play with it. Claws had even punctured the skin, but the incident had stuck with him. I'm sorry, big guy, I don't understand. Are you saying that Nighty-Night is a cat? No, Nighty-Night is a monster, Daddy. He hurt me. I looked back at the scratches. They were obviously real, but just as obviously they hadn't been caused by any monster. Something else had happened. I wanted to make it clear that I never thought for a second Ian was lying to me. Sure, he was... Oh, thank you for the follow! Someone say what? Yes, I did say horror story. I am currently reading Nighty Night. So I shall continue reading. That I never thought for a second that Ian was lying to me. Sure, he was prone to the occasional fib, just like any young child was, but he never lied to me about important things. Besides, he was too scared to be making up a story. Scooping Ian into my arms, I carried him into the bathroom and got the first aid kit out of the cabinet. As I sat down on the toilet and maneuvered him into my lap, I mentally slapped my forehead. The past few nights I had forgotten to trim his fingernails when I had given him a bath. He must have scratched himself in his sleep. It had woken him up, and his still half asleep mind must have interpreted the whole thing as a monster attacking him. I quickly bandaged the scratches before trimming his nails with the small silver clipper. He had calmed down by that point, and I gave him a hug before carrying him back into his room. When I went to pull him down in the bed, however, put him down in the bed, however, he held onto me so tightly that I nearly tipped forward. He absolutely refused to sleep in his bedroom that night. We ended up falling asleep together on the couch downstairs. And by the time that the sun was up, he was back to his usual self. The events of the previous night seemed to be forgotten. It was Saturday, and because I didn't have to work on the weekends, I. You're the dude who joined um the other night, Friday night, for my stream. Anyways, back to the story. It was Saturday because I didn't have to go to work on the weekends. I took Ian to a local state park. We spent the entire day playing on the playground and splashing around in the lake. By the time we left the park and headed home, we were both exhausted. He fell asleep in his car seat, and just a few minutes away from the house, I carried him inside and up to his bed. He remained passed out through the entire process. I planned to let him sleep for an hour or so. He still needed to eat dinner, and I knew that if he napped for too long, it would be almost impossible to get him down that night. I kicked off my shoes and flopped down in a chair to enjoy the momentary silence. Okay, you can tell a story. I'll pause. You can. Go right ahead. Okay. And just so you know, I am reading this. That was a really good story. I liked it. Alright, back to Nighty Night by Tim something. I forget his last name. Silence didn't last long. It was shattered by Ian's screaming. It wasn't a yelp or crying out like it had been the previous night. It was a full scream, one filled with pain and terror. I yelled his name as I leaped up from the stairs and burst into his room. Ian was seated on the floor, his thumb in his mouth and his eyes watery. He was rocking back and forth slowly. He looked up at me with a blank expression, as if he knew that I was there, but my presence didn't mean anything to him. I picked him up. As I did, I felt something warm and wet on my hand. I pulled it away from his back and saw that there was blood on my fingers. Just as I had the night before, I carried him into the bathroom and turned on the light. I immediately saw his back reflecting off the mirror over the sink, and I felt like ice was poured into my veins. Pieces of his shirt were torn away, and shreds that remained were red with blood. I set Ian on the counter and lifted his shirt up over his head. He was unresponsive during the entire process, and the part of me that was still thinking clearly wondered if he was in shock. On his back were 3 cuts, each of them spaced roughly the same distance as the scratches on his leg. These were much deeper than those, though, and they were bleeding freely. I bandaged. I do? I bandaged them as fast as I could before taking him downstairs and back out to the car. The cuts were too much for my basic first aid kit. He needed a doctor. The drive to the hospital was torture. I patted his car seat as much as I could with a blanket to try to take the pressure off his back, but he started screaming in pain before we got very far, knowing full well that it was illegal. I pulled over, unstrapped him, and set him down in the passenger seat, with him sitting sideways before getting back in and continuing to drive. Maybe that was the wrong call. Honestly, I don't know. All that I know is that I couldn't stand for him to be in any agony like that. The nurse behind the emergency room desk immediately waved through the door, and when she saw Ian's back through the window, she ran off to get a doctor while I carefully set him down on the nearby gurney. I hugged him as best as I could without touching his back and told him that everything was going to be okay. I know it hurts, little man, but I have to ask you something, I told him, giving him a reassuring smile. What happened? Nighty-night, he replied immediately as a matter-of-fact voice. Nighty-night hurt me. I didn't have time to question him farther. The doctor arrived. She took one look at Ian's back before telling a nurse to wheel him into the nearby examination room. I went to follow, but the doctor told me she thought it was best if I waited outside. Her eyes were looking past me as she spoke, and when I glanced over my shoulder, I saw that she was looking at a security guard standing at the far end of the hallway. If I had been thinking straight, I would have understood what was happening, but at the time I was too worried about Ian to figure out what that look meant. The doctor went to the examination room. As the nurse came back out, she put her hand on my arm gently and led me away from the door. I protested, of course, but she made it clear that I had to come with her and answer some questions before I was able to see Ian. She started by asking me if there were any pets or animals in the house, which I replied that there weren't. She asked me if I had been with anyone else when his injuries occurred. I told her that I hadn't. She followed up by inquiring if I had been drinking that day. That was the moment I started catching on. The hospital staff was trying to determine if I had been the one who hurt my son. At some point during the conversation, a man in a gray suit entered the hallway and came to the stop next to us. He introduced himself as a social worker and stated that his job was to make sure that Ian was safe and got the best care possible. He asked his own set of questions. I answered them the best I could, but I could tell that he wasn't believing me. It didn't help that I couldn't tell him what happened because I had no idea myself. Some time later, the doctor came back out of the room and informed me that while one of the cuts had been shallow enough to be bandaged, the other two require stitches. To say that I was erratic was an understatement. I wasn't upset that she had done what was medically necessary. I was angry that I had been kept out of the room the entire time instead of being there to comfort him during the process. She stood there calmly as I yelled, and once I had said my piece and was winding down, she told me that she recommended that Ian stay at the hospital overnight for observation. After taking a deep breath, I asked as calmly if I could if I would be able to stay with him. She didn't answer, but the social worker did. He told me in clearly practiced tone that due to the nature of his injuries, he was going to take Ian into custody for the night while he worked to determine the nature of his injuries. His tone might have been very pleasant and measured, but the implication behind his words was very clear. You think that I hurt Ian, I said, fighting back a second wave of anger. I would never hurt my son, even if you think that for 1 second I'm going to let you. That's enough, the social worker snapped off. You need to stop right there. I haven't made a determination one way or another if I think you did this. I will say that I've met a lot of abusive fathers in my time, and you don't strike me as one of them. I have the policies and protocols that I follow, though. What's best for everyone involved is you go home for the night, get some sleep, and let me do my job so I can put this behind us. It caught me off guard. I stared at him for long enough before nodding once. Anything I did other than what he told me to do would only jeopardize my situation, even if the thought of being apart from Ian for a night made me sick. I thought of him being taken permanently was much worse. I nodded again and he patted me on the arm. He told me to come back in the morning and ask for him at the desk before turning to go into the examination room. As I opened the door, I clearly heard Ian call out for me. I left the hospital feeling as if my entire world was burning before my eyes. I went home and immediately marched up to Ian's room. I determined I had figured out what happened to him. The scratches on his leg could have been explained by him causing him in his sleep, but cuts on his back were another matter. He couldn't have reached that area of his body. Even if he could have, there was no way that he could have made the markings that deep. Something else had happened. I tore apart his room looking for answers. A loose nail or screw that he leaned up against, a broken piece of bed that I hadn't noticed, a toy with something protruding, anything. I examined every inch of the room, top to bottom. I came up empty. There was nothing I could find that caused his injuries. Defeated, I leaned up against the wall and slid down to the floor. Something caught my eye. I reached over to pick up a small stuffed animal duck. Its yellow cloth had faded. Its overalls, it looked a bit worse for wear, but I could still easily identify it as the first toy that Ellen had brought for Ian. It had been right after we had found out that she was pregnant. She had named it Mr. Quackers, an absurd name for an absurd-looking duck. The events of the day caught up with me. I started to nod off. I felt my eyes growing heavier with each heartbeat. This was good, I reasoned. I would get them sleep and then be at the hospital the moment the sun began to rise. That was when I saw a creature standing in the corner of the room. One moment there was nothing there, and the next there was. Its extremely tall gray body bent over as it pushed up against the ceiling. Its limbs were extremely long and thin for the creature's size. Two arms ended in three needle-like fingers that had to have extended at least 3 feet from the hands. It stretched out its elongated neck with its face. Its lips, dry and cracked and missing an entire chunk in some places, were pulled back into an eternal grin that exposed its oversized white teeth. The lidless eyes were black in the center, and the areas on a person that would have been white were the dried yellow color of old parchment. Dark ichor had pooled on the jaws and slowly dripped on the floor as it watched me. Nighty night, the creature rasped out. My entire body jumped as I snapped back into full consciousness. The creature was gone again, with no trace that had been there in the first place. Spots where ichored and splattered onto the floor and the spots where ichor had splattered onto the floor had vanished. I sat on the floor alone in the room with my pulse racing and my breath coming in short gasps. I would have attempted to rationalize what I had seen. It probably would have been easy enough to convince myself that I imagined it, and it was a trick of the light that my nearly unconscious mind had twisted into a horrifying vision. It was a perfectly rational explanation. The problem was that I had seen it. I knew it had been real, and there was no question in my mind. It wasn't possible, but I was sure that it had been occupying the corner of the room across me seconds earlier. My breathing slowed, and my panic was slowly replaced by nausea as a realization came to me. Ian had also seen this creature. It had stood over my 4-year-old son with that nightmarish face and had proceeded to hurt him not once, but twice. If I was this scared, I couldn't fathom how frightened he'd be. Nighty night, Ian called it nighty night. It must have said the same thing to him as it had said to me. I got off the floor and left the bedroom, closing the door behind me. I stood in the hall for a moment before rushing to the bathroom and throwing up in the toilet. It went on for quite some time, so long that I started to wonder if it would ever stop. When it finally did, I collapsed against the bathtub, lightheaded and close to passing out. That's when there was a loud thud inside of Ian's room. I lifted my head as best as I could and looked out the bathroom doorway. I managed to focus my eyes just in time to see the knob on the door start to turn. There was an audible click. The door slowly swung open. Nighty Night's face looked up much of the bedroom doorway as it grinned at me. I tried to stand up, but I was too weak from throwing up to manage it. I could only watch as Nighty Night pressed its head against the wood frame. It was too large to make it through the opening. My feeling of relief was only momentary. Nighty Night started to push its head harder. Its face stretched back as the head slowly began to force its way through. It was like watching rubber being forced through a hole. Nighty night, it rasped, coming out distorted through the stretched lips. I had to leave, and I had to do so quickly. More of the monster's head was making it through the doorway every second, and it wouldn't be long before it was free of the room's confinement. Ignoring my aches and pains, I forced myself into a standing position. My head swam, and once again, I was sure that I was going to pass out, but somehow I was able to barely remain conscious. Nighty Night's face was almost all the way through the doorway now. I stumbled into the hallway and pressed myself up against the wall opposite from the creature's. Being as careful as I could, I moved past it, feeling its hot breath on me as I could. Its teeth were inches away from my body. I made it through the thin opening and hurried down the stairs. My foot caught on the last step. It wasn't enough to make me lose my balance entirely, but it did trip me, and I stumbled forward before falling over the side of the couch. My head struck one of the armrests. I must have been blacked out. I don't remember doing so, but the next thing I knew, I was being awoken by the sound of knocking. I sat up on the couch and immediately regretted doing so, as the worst headache had ever greeted me. The knocking continued. It took me a second to realize someone was banging on the front door. I stood up and took 2 steps towards the door before I remembered what happened. I looked at the stairs, expecting to see Nighty Night squeezing its way down the hallway towards me, but the creature was gone. Still a bit dazed and not sure what else to do, I continued towards the front door and opened it. Standing on the other side was a large man in a police uniform. He was holding a clipboard under his arm in a pen once. He nodded at me but didn't smile. He asked me my name and I gave it to him. Informed me that he was here at the request of a social worker from the hospital and that he would like to inspect my son's room. I moved aside and let him into the house. I closed the door behind him and led him up the stairs. I didn't want to go anywhere near the second floor after what I had experienced, but if I didn't comply with his request, it would undoubtedly impact my chances of getting Ian back as soon as possible. I took him to the still open bedroom door and we went inside. Nighty Night wasn't there, of course. The officer took the clipboard out from under his arms and asked me a few questions. I answered them the best I could. He scribbled some notes on the paper as I spoke. Seemingly satisfied with my response, he got down on one knee and examined the safety rail that ran along the, the sides of Ian's bed. Have you done anything in this room since you brought your son into the hospital? He asked. I looked around trying to figure out what happened. Okay, but did you change the bed sheets or anything like that? No, I just moved things around and put them back. I didn't change the sheets. Well, it looks like Mr. Eaton was right. Mr. Eaton, the social worker assigned to your son. See here? There's no blood on the sheets. But there are 3 streaks along the safety rails. They match up to where the poles were. You think that your son tried to get out of the bed while he was still out of it and slid over the rail. He must have caught the poles just right through the fabric and dug into him. Cute kid, by the way. He said he was going nighty-night and that his back started feeling ouchy when he got out of bed. Eaton put the things together from there. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The theory was wrong, and Ian's words had been completely misinterpreted. The blood trails that had been spacing out the rails were pure coincidence. It was working completely in my favor, though. Good thing, too, he continued. If he hadn't figured it out, or if I had found anything to prove him wrong here, we might be having a very different conversation right now. Seemingly satisfied with everything, the officer left and went back to his car. I watched him through the window as he pulled out and headed down the street. The sun was starting to come up over the trees, and I could hear a family of robins in the front yard tree chirping. I decided that it was close enough to morning to go back to the hospital and get my son back. It went smoother than I had expected. The social worker had me fill out some quick paperwork so they had my statements for the record, and after that he led me to a patient room on the opposite side of the hospital. He barely opened the door for me when Ian came running up to me barefooted with his little hospital gown waving behind him and practically jumped into my arms. He hugged me tightly, being careful to avoid the white bandages covering his stitches. I hugged him back. We stood there for what seemed like an eternity, me crying him and telling me about his day in the hospital. That was 2 months ago. The house that I raised Ian in is currently for sale, and my retailer tells me there are a number of people interested, even though it hasn't been listed for very, very long. The seller's market, she calls it. I've only been back twice since that night, one to pick up our clothes and the other necessary items, one to pack the remainder of our belongings, put them into storage. Both times during the middle of the day, and each time I made arrangements for Ian to stay with someone else instead of accompanying me. We have been living at a hotel on the other side of town. My long-term plan is for us to move far away, possibly all the way to the coast. I want to put as much distance as between us and this place as possible. Last week, I read a newspaper article about a local officer that killed his wife. According to the report, he said he had just started to doze off one night when a giant monster appeared in his room. He grabbed the gun and kept it in his nightstand and fired off 5 shots at it. The monster disappeared, but his wife had been walking into the room at the time with 2 bullets strike her, killing her almost instantly. No one believes him, of course. How could they possibly have? It was a ludicrous story. He seemed so convinced that he was telling the truth that a psychological evaluation was ordered before formal charges were filed. 3 days later, he was found dead in his cell. Not just dead, but damn near decapitated. The police are baffled. He was alone in his cell, and there was nothing he could have used to do that himself. The guards think that one of the other prisoners got in and did the job. Former cops don't have a lot of friends in jail, after all. They're at loss to explain just how a prisoner could have got into the cell and caused so much damage without alerting anyone. This was the same officer that had come to my house. I know what happened to him. It was the same thing that almost happened to both myself and my son. It was nighty night. I think that I've gotten the creatures appearing and disappearing act figured out. I was on the verge of becoming unconscious both times when I saw it. The first time I was almost asleep, and the second time I was trying not to pass out. When I actually did black out, it didn't harm me. The officer said in his statement that he was falling asleep when he saw the monster in his room. I think nighty night exists in that ever so brief moment between awake and asleep. When you enter into that moment, you can see it, and it can look right back at you. Or maybe I'm wrong and it's always there, watching and waiting until it can come for you in that short time where your world and its are connected. I don't know. I don't have all the answers. I doubt I ever will. Knowing exactly what Ian had gone through might provide more insight, but it doesn't matter. I refuse to ask him about it. He's sleeping through the night now that his wounds have mostly healed, and I'm not going to dread up bad memories that could only hurt him. He deserves to be safe and protected from both natural and unnatural. He's been through enough already. I'm afraid that he's going to be through more before this is all over. Last night I watched him sleeping on a bed in a hotel, and I started to drift off in an uncomfortable chair in the corner of the room. I was just about when I heard something through the glass window to my right. It was a faint, as if coming quiet from the distance, but I recognized it immediately. Nighty night, the raspy voice called out in the darkness. I jerked awake immediately and stood up and started packing our things, being careful not to wake up Ian as I did. He needed his rest. We were going to be on the road for a long, long time. Credit to Tim Sprague for writing the story Nighty Night. That was a really good horror story.